The Deadwater stage went off the switchback at Miller's Grade on a bright morning in the spring of 1886, and it took 9 souls down 200 feet of rock into the river. And the man who owned the line stood at the top of the grade an hour later and told the gathered town it was a runaway team, a spooked horse, a thing no man could have foreseen. His name was Harlan Pruitt, and he said it standing in the road with his hat pressed to his chest, which is how the powerful always deliver a lie, grieving and bareheaded, so that to doubt them is to spit on the dead. The tone was called Salvation Bend, set down in a fold of the Colorado high country where 2 hard roads crossed, and the only reason a soul stopped there at all was to change horses on the run between the Silver Camps and the railhead. The stage was the artery of the place. Every letter, every payroll, every drummer and bride and coffin that came or went on Pruitt's coaches, up and down grades so steep that a driver rode the brake as much as the lines, and a coach on Miller's Grade hung its whole weight and every life inside it on a few straps of leather and the iron they buckled to. And on that bright morning a strap had let go on the steepest pitch of the worst grade in the county, and the brake had gone slack, and the team had run, and the coach had gone over, and Harlan Pruitt called it the hand of fate. There was one person in Salvation Bend who knew that leather better than the road did, and she stood at the edge of the crowd with wax on her fingers and said nothing, because she had made it. Her name was Adeline Cruz, and she was the saddler. Not a cobbler who patched boots, though she could do that too. A saddler built the things that held a rider to a horse and a coach to its team, the harness and the heavy rigging that took the strain of 10,000 miles of mountain road. She ran the only saddlery in that part of the high country, a narrow shop off the crossing with the smell of oak-tanned hide and neatsfoot oil soaked so deep into the walls that a man breathed it a block away, and she stitched the things a stage town cannot live without and cannot make itself. She made the driver's lines and the thoroughbraces the coaches swung on, and she made brake straps. Adeline Cruz was 39 years old that spring. She had come west married to a harness maker and buried him inside 3 years, and she had kept his trade because it was the only thing he left her that could not be drunk or gambled or stolen in the night. She was a small, square-shouldered woman with sandy hair going gray at the temples, hands scarred white from 40 years of awl and knife, and eyes the still brown of oiled leather. She worked her bench with the unhurried patience of someone who has learned that a rushed stitch is the one that kills a man 40 miles from home. Folk in Salvation Bend called her the Widow Cruz, some of them kindly and some of them not, and she answered to it either way, because a name you will not flinch at cannot be turned into a whip. Now there is a thing about handwork in leather that the storybooks never trouble to learn, and it is this. Every saddler of any pride marks her work. Blind stamped cold under a buckle where only the maker would ever think to look, Adeline set her mark, a small running horse inside an oval, and beside it the year. She struck it into every piece of consequence that left her bench, the way a gunsmith cuts his name into a lock plate, the way a silversmith punches his hallmark into the foot of a cup. It was pride, partly, but it was more than pride. It was warranty, and it was memory. If a strap failed on the road, the mark said whose hand had made it, and a saddler who stood behind her mark could be trusted with a life, and one who did not keep a shop long in a country where a parted strap on a grade meant a funeral. Adeline Cruz had never once been ashamed of her mark, and there was more to her hand than the stamp, and this is the part that mattered later. She stitched by hand, saddler's stitch. 2 needles crossing through an awl hole she slanted always the same way, a hair off true. The mark of a right-handed woman pulling toward herself across thousands of straps until the slant was as much her signature as the running horse. And she used linen thread run through her own beeswax, never the hard machine glued thread the factories back east were beginning to ship. A strap she made had holes an awl had cut on a slant, thread a hand had waxed, and a horse in an oval struck under the buckle. A strap she did not make had none of those things, and to a saddler that was as plain as a stranger's face, in a small church. The autumn before the wreck, Harlan Pruitt had come to her shop and ordered a full set of new brake rigging for the Deadwater coaches, the leathers that stood between a loaded coach and a 200-foot fall. She had made them the right way, the only way she knew, heavy skirting leather from the butt of the hide where the fiber runs tightest, doubled and stitched saddler's stitch with waxed linen, each hole cut on her slant, and into the flesh side of every strap she had, blind struck the running horse and the year. 1885, so that as long as those straps held a coach on the grade, they carried her name down the mountain with every passenger who rode. She had fitted them herself, set every buckle with her own hands. Those straps would not part. She had staked her name on them, and her name was the only thing she owned in the world that no bank could foreclose. So when Harlan Pruitt stood at the top of Miller's Grade and said the leather had let go because fate willed it, Adeline Cruz knew, standing there with wax on her fingers, that either the leather she waxed by hand had turned traitor overnight, or the strap that parted was not a strap she had ever made. Harlan Pruitt was 52 years old, a lean, handsome man with silver at the temples and a gold watch chain across a good wool vest, who had come to the high country with a contract in his pocket and turned it into a monopoly by the oldest method there is, which is to charge every soul the most the road will bear and spend on that road the least it will survive. He held the mail contract and the express contract and the note on the livery and the goodwill of the territorial delegate. He lived in the tall clapboard house above the crossing, the only one with a real staircase. He was not a monster. That is the thing people always get wrong. He gave the church its bell. He wept true tears at the burying. 9 graves cut into the Cold Spring ground in a single afternoon, and I do not believe the tears were false. Harlan Pruitt had simply learned across a long and prosperous life that there is the price of a thing and there is the cost of a thing, and that a shrewd man arranges for other people to pay the cost while he pays only the price. So it was with the leather. Because Adeline's rigging was dear, and leather wears as all leather wears, and a coach line running mountain grades ought to have replaced those brake straps long before they failed, at Adeline's price, in Adeline's shop. Harlan Pruitt was not careful with money. He was careful only with money. He had bought instead, from a jobber down at the railhead who asked no questions, a set of cheap machine-made straps, factory leather cut from the thin belly of the hide where the fiber runs loose, holes punched by a machine, and the seams held with glued thread in place of stitching. The kind of strap that looks the same as good rigging to any eye but a saddler's and costs a third as much, and cannot take the shock of a loaded brake on a spring grade without tearing along the punch line like paper along a fold. And he had ordered them fitted in place of Adeline's straps, quietly, on a Sunday, at the far barn down the road when her shop was shut and the saddler was not there to see the belly leather go on where the butt leather belonged. And here is where the powerful always make the same mistake, the mistake written into the very shape of their advantage. Harlan Pruitt believed that because he had swapped the leather, the truth had gone over the cliff with it. He thought a strap was a strap, and that a broken strap 200 feet down in a spring flood was a strap no one would ever read. He did not understand that a torn strap still carried, or did not carry, a running horse struck cold into its flesh side, and holes cut on a slant or punched dead straight, and thread waxed by a hand or glued by a machine, and that whether the mark was there or absent was a fact as hard and plain as the iron of the buckle, and that no amount of grieving bareheaded on a grade could stamp a mark into leather a saddler had never touched. He owned the line. He owned the express office and the livery and the delegate's ear. He did not own the truth of the leather, because the truth of the leather had been settled the autumn before, at a bench he had entered exactly once, by a woman he thought of, when he thought of her at all, as the widow Cruz who stitched his lines. Now there is a piece of real history worth knowing here, because it is the ground this whole story stands on. The staging West killed travelers by the hundred, and the killing was almost never called a crime. It was called a runaway, and it was called the risk of the road, and most of all it was called an act of God, because the coroner in a company town drew his fee from the company, and the men on the jury freighted for the line or owed it money, and the owner stood the whiskey after. Up and down the mountain roads of Colorado and the Sierra, stages went off grades with sickening regularity, and every wreck was a coin toss between honest wear and dishonest thrift, and the dead in the river could not say which. What broke that pattern, on the rare morning it was broken, was almost never a lawman and almost never a lawyer. It was the craft. It was one person who could pick up a parted strap and read in the grain of the leather and the cut of the holes whether it was good rigging worn past its day or bad rigging that should never have been hung over living souls at all. That reading was a kind of literacy that almost no one on a stage road possessed, and the one who possessed it in Salvation Bend was the saddler, and Harlan Pruitt had forgotten she could read. The day after the burying, Adeline Cruz walked out to Miller's Grade and asked the line's men to help her bring up the wreck, the harness and the rigging and all, and Pruitt's road agent turned her back at the head of the switchback and told her the grade was closed for the recovery of the dead, which was a lie so thin you could read a hymnal through it. The grade was closed because Pruitt meant to send his own men down first, on ropes, to cut the straps free of the smashed coach and burn them, or weight them and sink them in the river pool below the falls where the current turned and gave nothing back, and hang a set of proper straps on the salvaged rigging, or hang nothing, and let the spring flood carry the proof to the sea. Adeline understood this the moment she was turned back. She went home to her shop, and she did not rage and she did not weep, though she had cut the wedding harness for one of the 9 and had sold a first saddle to the boy who drove that coach when he was 15 and proud, and could not stop grinning. She sat on her stool in the last light with a strap end in her scarred hands, and she thought the way leather takes oil, slowly, all the way through. And then she did 3 things, in order, the way she did everything. First, she found the survivor. There had been 10 aboard, not 9, and 1 had lived, a drummer named Silas Vane, who had been riding the box beside the driver for the air and had been thrown clear into a stand of scrub oak when the coach first slewed before it went over, and had come to at the bottom with a broken arm and the wit to crawl. Silas Vane had seen the strap part. More than that, in the long hour he lay waiting to be found, hurting and half out of his head, he had dragged himself to the piece of rigging that lay nearest in the rocks, because a hurt man holds to the nearest solid thing, and he had gripped a torn brake strap the whole time and would not let it go when they carried him up, and no one had thought to take it from a raving, injured man. He gave it to her that evening, ashamed, certain he had stolen something. She laid it across her bench under the lamp and looked at it a long while, turning it in her hands. It was thin. Not the deep, even thickness of butt leather, but the loose, spongy stuff off the belly of the hide, and the tear did not run ragged along hand-slanted all holes the way good stitching tears, giving and stretching before it lets go. It ran dead straight along a row of machine-punched holes, clean as a coupon torn from a page. The thread at the seam was hard and glued, not soft waxed linen, and there was no mark on it, no running horse, no year. It was not her strap. It had never been her strap. This leather had come off a set of factory rigging, and Adeline Cruz had never in her life hung belly leather on a brake, because belly leather on a brake is not thrift, it is manslaughter, and every saddler alive knows it. The second thing she did was make a witness that could not be bought. She took a length of the same heavy skirting leather she had used the autumn before, from the same run of hide, and she cut a strap to the very pattern of the brake straps she had fitted to the Deadwater coaches, and she stitched it saddler's stitch on her slant with waxed linen. And into the flesh side she blind-struck the running horse and the ear, and she laid it on the bench beside the torn strap from the grade. Now there were 2 straps side by side, hers, thick and stitched and slant-holed and marked, and the one from the river, thin and glued and punched and blank. Any freighter, Any juror, any judge could take the two up in his two hands and feel the difference in the very heft of them, and could see with his own eyes that the leather that killed 9 people had never crossed Adeline Cruz's bench, which meant someone had stripped off the strap she made and hung a cheaper set in their place, and there was exactly one man in Salvation Bend with the keys to the barn and the reason to spend a third as much. Before I go on, do one thing for me, because this next part is the turn the whole story rides on. If you have ever known that a thing was true and been told by a man in a good coat that it was not, tap that subscribe. Not for me. For the widow Cruz, and for every soul who ever held the proof in their hand while a powerful man explained it away. Now the third thing she did was make it impossible to bury. She knew that if she carried 2 straps and an accusation to Harlan Pruitt alone, she would be a grief-mad widow gone soft with sorrow, and the straps would vanish, and so, quite possibly, would she. Straps part. Widows drown in spring rivers. So, she did not go to Pruitt. She went, before the sun was up, to the one power in that country the stage line did not own, and it was not the coroner, and it was not the marshal, and it was not the church. It was the freighters. The teamsters and mule skinners of Salvation Bend were a rough guild of the same hard roads, the way men who trust their lives to leather and grade always are. Because when you ride a loaded wagon down a mountain, you learn fast that the only thing between you and the rocks is the strap on the brake and the hand that made it. She sent the drummer's boy running from yard to yard in the last dark before the freight pulled out, and she asked the teamsters to come to her shop before they hitched, every man of them, and to bring the widow of the driver if she could walk. And they came. They filled her narrow shop the way freight fills a wagon, shoulder to shoulder in the lamplight, 30 teamsters and a woman in black, and Silas Vane White faced on a stool with his arm in a sling, and Adeline Cruz laid the 2 straps on the bench where every man could see. She did not make a speech. She was not a speaking woman. She held up the strap she had cut that night and said, "This is the leather I made for those coaches last autumn, and it carries my mark, and I have never once been ashamed to put my name in a strap a man hangs his life on." Then she held up the torn strap from the grade, and she turned it so the lamplight fell on the blank flesh side where a mark should be and was not. And she said, "This is the leather that parted yesterday, and it carries no mark at all." Because the man who hung it knew better than to let it carry one. And an old teamster named Emmett Rourke, who had freighted 40 years from the Missouri to the Sierra and had buried more partners than he could count, took the torn strap in his own cracked hands and bent it, and looked at the punched holes and the glued seam and the thin belly grain, and he went gray under his beard, because he read exactly what she had read. And he said, in a voice the whole shop heard, "This is belly leather glued and punched. This never should have gone on a break. No man should have rolled down Miller's grade on this." And that was the moment the act of God died in Salvation Bend, not with a gunshot, but with an old freighter bending a strap in the lamplight and naming the leather for what it was. Word runs downhill faster than a runaway team, and it reached Harlan Pruitt in his tall house before the freight had cleared the crossing, and here the powerful man made his last mistake, the one his whole comfortable life had trained him to make. He believed that a thing could be managed. He came down to the saddlery himself, with 2 men from the express office a pace behind him, hard men who drew his wage, and he came expecting to find a broken widow he could soothe or scare, and he found instead half his freighters packed into a leather shop looking at 2 straps on a bench. Harlan Pruitt was a clever man, and he saw the play had gone bad the instant he crossed the sill. But a man who has never once in his life been told no does not know the shape of the word, and so he tried. He took off his hat, because it had always worked before, and he spoke of the terrible sorrow of it, and of the cruel mystery of accidents on mountain roads, and of a generous fund he would raise for the families, more than any court would think to ask. And Adeline Cruz let him finish, because leather is patient. Then she took up the torn strap, and she walked to him through the parting crowd, and she put it in his soft, clean hand and closed his fingers over it, and she said the thing that Salvation Bend would carry down its generations. the thing they would tell their sons at the head of Miller's Grade for 40 years after. She said, "You can buy a strap that looks like mine, cut and dyed and buckled to fool any eye that passes it on the road. But you cannot buy my mark, because a mark is not a thing you purchase, it is a thing you earn one honest stitch at a time, and yours was never worth the leather it would be struck in." Then she told him, in front of every man he thought he owned, that the marked strap and the blank strap were both going down to the county seat that very day, in the hands of the freighters, with 30 sworn men to swear where they came from, and that no fire he could set and no river pool he could sink them in would unmake a tear that 30 men had already read with their own hands. Harlan Pruitt stood in the saddler's shop with the torn strap in his fist and looked at the faces of the men who hauled his freight and drove his coaches, and he understood, slowly, the way a proud man understands the ground going soft under his boots, that the one thing he had never bought was the only thing that counted now. Not the coroner, not the delegate, the leather, and you cannot buy the leather. It is already what it is. Emmett Rourke stepped up beside Adeline then, and he looked at Harlan Pruitt and he said, "Quiet. I have driven good rigging, and I have driven bad, and I always knew in my hands which was which, and I said nothing all these years for the wage." And he set his coiled whip down on the bench, which in a teamster's language is a thing with a meaning, and he said, "I am done hauling for a man who buys his straps by the price." And one by one the freighters of Salvation Bend laid their whips down on that bench beside the 2 straps until there was a heap of them, leather on leather, and no freight rolled out of Salvation Bend that morning, and no coach was hitched. And the crossing that had never once been quiet in 20 years went still as a held breath, and the silence over Salvation Bend was the loudest thing that town had ever heard. That was the reckoning. Not a shot fired. 30 whips on a bench and a crossing that would not run until the truth had gone down to the county seat and back. The rest is the record, and the record is plain as a slant-cut hole. A deputy marshal and a road commissioner came up from the county seat inside the week on the strength of 2 straps and 30 depositions, and the commissioner, a hard old man who could read a strap as well as any saddler, held Adeline's marked strap and the Rivers blank strap up side by side and swore that no honest hand had ever hung that punched belly leather over living passengers. The jobber down at the railhead, faced with a charge that could hang him, remembered very fast who had bought a cheap set of factory brake straps for cash on a Sunday and produced the order in the hand of Pruitt's own barn boss. Pruitt was tried at the county seat in the summer of 1886, not for an accident, which is no crime, but for the willful fitting of unsound equipment resulting in death, and the marked strap and the blank strap lay on the clerk's table the whole trial, and the jury, which was not a company jury this time, passed the 2 straps hand to hand a long while before they rose, and came back before the courthouse clock had turned the hour. He was convicted, and he was given 12 years, and he did not weep bareheaded then, because there was no town left to weep for. His tall house with the real staircase was sold to satisfy the widow's judgments, and the man who bought it was a freight boss who had come up off the box, and that was a kind of justice too. The 2 men from the express office were gone from the county the night the whips went down on the bench, the way hired men always go when the wage stops being worth the risk. Adeline Cruz did not become a legend the way the fast men do. There were no dime novels about a woman who stitched leather, but the line reopened under new owners with proper butt leather rigging on every coach, and Adeline Cruz cut and stitched that rigging, and into the flesh side of every brake strap she blind struck the running horse and the year, and the passengers who rode Miller's Grade never knew whose name went down the mountain with them. But the drivers knew, and they trusted it, because they had seen what her mark was worth and what a blank strap was worth, and the difference was 9 graves above the crossing. She took the drummer Silas Vane, who could not go back to the road with a mended arm and a memory like his, and she taught him the trade, to cut and to stitch and to strike his mark and to read a strap in the lamplight, and years on, when she was in the ground herself, he ran that shop and struck into the corner of her stone, small where you had to look for it, a running horse in an oval. But the mountain does not learn. and neither does the money that owns the roads across it. Harlan Pruitt was one man, and the thing that made him was not one man. Down at the county seat, the men who held the mail contract simply let it out again to the next bidder, and the next owner cut the next corner, more quietly, having learned from Pruitt's fall not what a saddler learns, but only what a swindler learns, which is to hide the order better and burn the strap sooner. That is the terrible patience of it. The leather does not lie, but a man can learn to sink it in the pool below the falls before any hand that can read it ever holds it. There will always be another grade and another cheap strap and another owner bareheaded in the road, calling it the hand of fate. What there is not always is a saddler off the crossing who cut the true rigging, kept the pattern, and was not afraid of her own name. Adeline Cruz stitched leather in Salvation Bend for 22 more years, until the railroad came at last through the low pass and the stages stopped running and the grade grew over. And for as long as any of those 30 teamsters lived, when a stranger came through talking easy about runaways and acts of God and the terrible risks of the mountain roads that no one could have foreseen, some old freighter would take him to the saddlery that still stood off the empty crossing and show him 2 straps kept side by side on a shelf, one marked and one blank, and tell him about the morning the freight would not roll, and how the whole town learned that a lie can be cut and dyed to look like the truth, but cannot be made to carry an honest mark, and how the Widow Cruz broke a man who owned every road in the county with a single strap of leather that owned nothing but the truth. That was the whole of what Adeline Cruz knew, and it was enough, this once, in this one hard crossing under this one grade, to make the leather speak for 9 people who could not. She did not end the thing that kills travelers on mountain roads. No one person ends it. She only stopped it here, and sometimes here is the most a good woman gets, and it is not nothing. It is not nothing at all. Before you go, I want one thing from you. Comment below. 3 words. Where are you from? The country, the city, the place you are sitting right now as you listen. I read them all. This has been the story of Salvation Bend, the spring the strap parted, and the owner called it the hand of fate, and a saddler answered him with the one thing he could not buy. So tell me what you believe was the real weapon that broke Harlan Pruitt. Was it the mark she struck into every honest thing she made, the name she was never once ashamed of, or was it the courage of 30 hard freighters who finally laid down their whips and refused to roll for a liar? Comment below and tell me which one you would rather have on your side the day the powerful come to call your dead the hand of fate. Subscribe so you do not miss the next road we ride, because the mountains are many and the men who sell smooth lies are patient, and there is always another crossing learning the difference between the price of a thing and the cost of it. See you on the next road.